Good morning and thanks for joining this Enbridge webinar today. My name is Tim Adams and I'm joined by Fiona Powell in this second of our series of webinars this month. Your microphones are muted, but please use the chat feature to ask any questions, which we will go through at the end of the session. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Fiona. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you for the introduction, Tim. Hi, as Tim said, I'm Fiona, one of the trainers here at Enbridge, and today I'm going to be going through FlexiFields. Just before we start, I just want to go through and talk about what a FlexiField is. So a FlexiField is an additional tab that allows you to capture information or additional data on a master file. So you can either create fields, or you can display data from a browser inquiry, or you can even display data from an existing table in a database. So today I'm going to go through two different examples. The first example, I'm going to create some fields as an additional tab on the customer master file. And then the second example I'm going to do is a browser example, just so you can see the different options there. When you're creating a FlexiField, there are 3 steps. So the first step is actually creating the tab, the additional tab, what you want to see displayed, what you want to capture. The second step is then linking it to an attribute. So kind of in other words, where do you want that tab to appear? Is it on the customer master file, supplier master file, project, wherever you want it to appear? So that's the second step. And then the third step is giving access to it. So who do you want to give access to be able to see that additional tab, that new tab? So that's a bit of an overview on FlexiFields, but let's get started. So I'm just going to take over and share my screen, and hopefully you can all see this okay. And then we can get started. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually create the FlexiField group definition. So I'm going to go into the settings area of the system, and then I'm going to navigate from system administration down to system setup, FlexiField group definition, and I'm going to expand that folder and then choose FlexiField group definition. I'm just going to minimize my menu just so that you can see the screen in full and see more columns going across there. So the FlexiField group that I'm going to create, I want to capture additional information on the customer master file. So I'm just going to make up some fields. So they might not completely make sense, and I apologize for that, but I'm just going to try and add a few fields with different data types just so that you can see the different options. So the FlexiField group, the first thing it wants is a name for this group. This is going to be relating to customer details. So I'm just going to call it Cust Det. And then as soon as I tab across, you'll see it fills in information for me. So it's filtered in a description, the same as the name of the group, but obviously I can then change that. So I'm going to edit that, sorry, typing, and I'm going to call that customer details. It's going to create a physical table in the database. And this is the table name that the system gives it automatically. So you can see here it's AFX Cust Det. So that stands for A for Aggresso, FX because it's a FlexiField table, and then the name of the FlexiField group that I've created. So that's where it's getting that naming convention from. The next option is the type, and there are 3 types, like I mentioned. I can either create a FlexiField group, which is where I'm creating fields that can go into a tab, or I can use a browser template, so I can then display the results of that browser template as an additional tab, or existing table, where I can display data from a table in the database. So the first example, as I said, I'm going to do a FlexiField group. Underneath that, the view format, it gives me 2 options. I can display this either as fields, and I'm kind of wiggling my cursor around this area, and this is how it would look. So there'd be fields like drop-down boxes, check boxes, date fields. The other option is table, and that's at this bottom area of the screen. So I could display it in rows and columns if I would prefer. I'm going to go for the fields option so you can see how that looks. We then have a status. And the status is either active or closed. And of course, in this case, it's going to be active. So as I said, I'm going to just create a few fields with different data types just to give you examples. So I'm going to say customer details. I want to maybe find out if they've had a credit check. So the field name I'm going to give it is credit check. And as soon as I tab off the title, you'll see that it's actually going to give you the name of that field within the table, how it's going to be stored. So it's storing it as credit underscore check underscore FX because it's a FlexiField field. The bit that I need to go into next is choosing the data type. So what type of field is this? Is it going to be a text field, an integer, a date, an attribute? As I said, I'm going to add several fields and just choose some of these different data types just to give you some examples. So in this case, I'm just going to choose that it's a checkbox. So I choose checkbox and then tab across, and it's not an attribute, it's not a relation, so it's literally just jumped straight across so that I can then choose the field width. The field width and data length, I will explain a little bit more about when we come to do a text box. But just skipping over that, the next option then is I can choose whether to make this mandatory. So in other words, it has to be completed. I could choose to hide it. I could do a sum. So the reason being that you might want to hide is you might want to put a couple of different fields on there that you can then add those two together and then just display the results of the output of the third field. So you could hide the first two fields and then display the third. So that's the idea of the hide and the sum options. The next option there is read, and that's just allowing you to then make it read only if you want to make it read only. Val stands for validation. So you can actually set, if it's going to be things like a telephone number or a postcode, you can actually set the pattern for them to then enter. So they have to enter the 2 characters, text characters, and then the 2 numeric characters, a space, etc. Or it could also be predefining a list. But when we do the next example, we'll go in and have a look at that. So I can then just tab through. I don't want to make anything mandatory or hide. So the next field I was going to add then is maybe an amount. So they've had a credit check. What's their credit limit? So the field is credit limit. Again, it creates the field in the table for me. And this time, the data type is going to be an integer. And then I'm going to scroll across and I can then choose, is that going to be a small or large display format? I'm going to say small. The field width and data length. So the difference between these two, the data length is the number of characters that you're going to type into a field, whereas the field length is the size of the box around that text. So for example, if I come back up and look at status, I can see that I've got the text inside the box, and the box obviously going around it. So the active, the actual text there is the data length, and then status field width is the box around it. So I would always make the field width at least 2 characters bigger than the data length. Otherwise you end up with the text right up against the edge of the box. Cosmetically, I think it's nice to have the edge of the box, a gap, and then the start of the text, and likewise kind of at the end of that box. So that's the field width, and as I said, I'd normally make that 2 characters, if not more, bigger than the actual data length. So I'm going to say that the box is size 14, but I can type up to 12 characters in that box. Again, I'm not going to make it mandatory or hide it or do a sum on it or make it read only. So I'm just going to tab through. Sorry, it's not letting me up. That's going to be 9 characters for a small integer. Sorry. Scrolling through, the next field that I'm going to then add is who is their account manager. So typing in account manager, and this time the box that I'm going to add is going to be an attribute. So I choose attribute, tab across, I can then choose the attribute that I want to pull through. So I want a list of account managers. I've obviously already got those set up on the system, which is why I'm choosing an attribute. And I'm then going to pull through Resno as the attribute. Select it from the list. And I can then choose, when I'm pulling through the Resno, do I want to display the code or do I want to display the description? That's the display format. So I wouldn't want to pull through a number. I actually want to pull through the name of the account manager. So I'm choosing description here. Going across to the field width, I'm going to say that my field width is 52 characters, but it's already pulling through the code, the set format for the data length for me. But what I am going to do is then go into validation, and I'm just double clicking and it opens up this separate tab. And here it's showing me the attribute information. So it's pulling through the attribute of Resno, and it's then got a list of all of my possible resources. So I'm going to say that the account managers, and I'm just going to select from the list, scrolling down. So I'm going to say John Simmons, and I'm just clicking on the arrow to the right to move him across to my chosen value. And I'm going to have Bob Slay and then Stephen Harry. So that's my 3 account managers, but I could then just carry on and add all possible account managers from that list. Once I've selected the values, then I just click on OK, and it takes me back, closes that tab down and takes me back. And I can now see that I've got an X where that validation has been set. So just continuing with another example, sorry, I tabbed too far. I'm going to then say, I'm going to make up a list just to show you a sample of a text field. So I'm going to say, who was the customer relation contact? And I'm going to, this time, as I said, I'm going to make this a text field. So as I said, the examples are probably not great, but I'm just trying to show you the different data types and then the options that you get with the different data types as we go through. So once I choose text and then tab through, the display format in this case gives me the option of, do I want to display the information and force whatever anybody types in into uppercase or lowercase, or could it be any case, which is really what the user would then type in. So I'm going to say uppercase, I'm going to force that value to be uppercase. Again, I can then set my field width, so I'm going 52 and then 50 characters for the data length. I'm then going to go across to validation and double click to open up that tab. And this time, because I haven't actually selected an attribute, in this case, I can predefine and create my own list just by typing in information. So I'm going to say Fiona Powell, and you can see as I'm typing, it's forcing that into uppercase. So I type in my value, click on add, and it moves it down into this bottom area. And I can then continue to then add who these relation managers are going to be. So I've got myself and Tim, and I'm going to add one more. I'm going to add one of our other trainers. So I've got Trevor in there as well. Click on add. So I've now predefined a list, and this will give me a drop down list when I go to this text box. As I mentioned earlier, when you have maybe a field that's a phone number or a postcode, then down the bottom in this area here where it says regular expression, here's where you can predefine a pattern. So you could predefine sort of a dialing code and then a space and then a phone number. So there's all sorts of options that you've got in here as well. So I've got my list, I click on OK, and it takes me back to my tab. I'm just going to add one more field in here, and that's going to be date. And just the date that the credit check was done. So again, I'm just giving you an example of a date field. So in this case, the data type will be date. And it predefines what that data length is, and then you just decide on the size of the box. So as I said, I'm going 2 characters bigger than the actual data length. So I can tab across, and that's it. So that's the fields that I want to add and capture on my customer master file in this new tab. So I'm just going to save what I've got so far. When you save, it does clear the screen. So if I was just to come back into FlexiField group and then tab, you'll see if I tab, it then recalls and brings back all of that information. So that's the first step. I've defined the fields that I want to have displayed on my new tab. The second step is then linking it to say, well, where do I actually want that information to appear? So I'm going to click in the tools option at the top here, this link FlexiField group to attribute. So when I click on that, it opens up a new screen. And the first option is the attribute. So because I'm choosing this with customer details, the attribute that I want to link it to is the customer ID. And I've got a couple of in here that exist already. So I'm going to click on Insert Row. And I'm going to then select that FlexiField that I've just created, which was called CustDet for customer details. And I'm going to tab across. And as soon as I do that, it pulls through the description, it pulls through the table name. The first option I need to select or enter anything in is this tab column. And what this means is, what is the tab number going to be? Well, the customer master file already comes with 5 standard tabs. So I could type in tab number 6, because that would be the next available tab number. But it realizes and understands that if you put in a 1, that this is the first additional tab that it's then going to create. So in this case, I've got a couple of additional ones in there already. So I'm going to say that this is tab number 3, and it knows the order. It will always put it onto the end. I can then choose a name for the tab. So here I've got customer details, and I'm going to leave the description as that, but I could edit that tab name. And that's what we're seeing here, is kind of this tab name where I'm kind of wiggling the cursor, that's where it would appear. You can make it multilingual if that was something that you're using on your system. And then the next option is section. What this allows you to do is have multiple FlexiFields on the same tab, so that you might have section 1 at the top of the screen where I'm kind of wiggling here, where I've got fields and drop down boxes. And then I could have section 2, which is a table display of information down at the bottom of the screen. So you can have as many sections as you want within that FlexiField, within that tab. But this I'm going to put in as number 1. It's the first section on that new additional tab that I'm creating. Again, you can then change the section name if you want to something else, but I'm going to leave it as it is. I can then make it multilingual, and I can also make it mandatory. What that means is that it's mandatory to click on that tab. I haven't made any of the fields mandatory within the tab, so they don't have to fill something in, but it just means that in order, when you're creating a customer, you would have to actually physically click on this customer details tab to look at the information. So I'm going to leave that blank. I'm not going to actually make it mandatory, but as I said, you can make it mandatory if you want to. The next option then is connecting to a rule. So you can connect this to a rule group if that's appropriate. The very last column is status, and the status is either N or C for closed. So I'm going to leave this as N, which is open, active. It's kind of live. So that's me now linking it to the customer ID. So I'm going to click on save, and I've now saved it. So that's the 2 steps done. The final step then is to choose who is now going to have access to this new tab. So I'm just going to close those 2 screens down. I'm going back into my menu, and I'm going to go up to choose who's going to have access. So I'm going to go into System Admin, Users and Access, Menu-based Access, and I'm in the desktop, and I'm going to expand Home, and I'm going to go down to Financials, Accounts Receivable, Customer Master File, Customer, and then I'm going to open up the Tabs folder, and I will then see my new customer details tab, which is what it was called. And you'll see at the moment that nobody has got access, no users or no roles have access to that new tab. So I'm just going to scroll down in my list of roles and users and then choose who I'm going to give access to. So I'm logged in as system. So I'm just giving access. I've got 3 dots of system here. So I'm going to give access to the system role. So once I've chosen who's going to have access to that tab, I then click on save, and it will come up and say, do I want to allow access to subsections? There aren't any subsections, so it doesn't really matter if I say yes or no there, but I'm just going to say yes. And then as soon as I've done that, I'm going to then close down the tab and say yes to update the menu. And the final thing is to then go and test that we now have that new tab. So I'm just navigating into my EN client, and I'm going to go to financials, accounts receivable, customer master file. I'm going to open up a customer, and you can now see I've got tab 6, which is the first additional tab appearing here, and it's called customer details. So if I just bring up an existing customer and then tab through, I've got my standard 5 tabs: the address, invoice, payment, relation. If I now click on customer details, you'll see I've now got my tick box, my credit check. Have they had a credit check? Yes, they have. I can now type in what their credit limit is. I can then choose my account manager from the drop-down box. So remember, I chose the attribute of Resno, and then I selected Bob, John, and Steve. So I'm going to select John as the account manager. And I then created a text box and predefined my own list and just typed in manually. So I'm going to then say that I'm the relation manager for this customer. And then my final field that I added was a date field. So in here, I can then say I've put in today's date, and I've got my date field appearing. So that's creating the FlexiFields. The other thing with FlexiFields is once you've actually created them, you can then use those fields in inquiries and in workflow. So I'm just going to quickly show you how you would pull that through into an inquiry. So I'm just going to save that information, and I'm closing down the customer master file, going back into my menu. And if I was to right click over the customer master file, click on open browser, here's the main browser screen. If I select customer ID and then right click, I can then bring in and add a flexi field. So I click on add flexi field. Here's my customer details flexi field that I've just created. And then there's all of those fields, and I can then bring those through and in to my inquiry. So you can see that I've pulled those through, and the source is saying it's coming from the flexi field. And if I was to go to the results, I'm just pulling through absolutely everything here. I've got those additional tabs appearing. And if I scroll down to the customer that I was just looking at, you can see the information that I've just then added. So that's how you can then display that in an inquiry as well. So that's the first example of creating an additional tab. The second example is I was going to do a browser inquiry. So in my accounts receivable folder under inquiries, I've actually created an inquiry already called open and historical items for all customers. And I've got a browser here called open items per customer, and that's what I want to be displayed. So the idea of this is a customer phones up and queries and says, I've got an outstanding item that I want to query, rather than going into the customer master file, bringing up their details, and then having to go and search for that customer in an inquiry to find out their open items. It's all displayed in that one tab, in that one master file. So that's what we're trying to achieve here. So I'm going to go through those 3 steps again. So create the FlexiField group definition, link it to the attribute, and then give access to it. So I'm going to go back into the settings area. I'm going into system admin. system setup, FlexiField group definition, FlexiField group definition. And I'm going to call this one, if I could type, open cust items. I think I'm restricted to the number of characters, so I've just got open cust item, and the description I'm going to have is open items. Again, you see it's created the table name as before, so A for Aggresso, FX for FlexiField, and then open cust item, which was the name of the FlexiField group. The status is active. But this time the type, rather than FlexiField group, I'm actually going to create a browser template. And as soon as I tab, you'll notice when I tab across, I now have template name. And it's taken out the name of the table that it's going to create, because it's just going to be displaying the results of a browser inquiry. So it wants me to select that browser inquiry, and I can see a list of all of the browsers that I've actually got saved on here. So they're in alphabetical order. So I'm just going to scroll down and find it. Oops, gone too far. So it was open items per customer. So there it is. And then as soon as I tab after selecting that, it then brings in all of those fields from that browser inquiry. Search criteria. It then says, what do you want to do with the search criteria that you've got set up in that inquiry? So do you not want to show it? Or do you want to show all search criteria, or just show prompted search criteria? In my case, I want to show prompted search criteria. So what this means is, if I just go back into my inquiry, is when I'm displaying the results on the tab, I don't want to bring through the results for every single customer. I only want the customer that I'm looking at in the customer master file. So I've set up a prompt so that if I come in here, that it's going to prompt me to enter the cust ID. So that's how it links that information together. So the idea is I go into the customer master file, type in my customer ID, and when I go to the browser results, it's only showing me the results for that particular customer, not all of them. So it's important that on your browser that you've got this search C and you've got cust ID and you're prompting for that cust ID. So if I just go back into my FlexiField group definition, that's where I'm selecting that. So I've got search prompted search criteria. Underneath that, then I've got all of the fields, so I don't need to do anything else in here. So I can save that new browser tab, and then I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. I now need to actually link that, just check that that's all saved, and I'm actually going to link it to an attribute. So I click in the tools option, link field group to attribute. The attribute again is going to be cust ID, and I tab, and there's the customer details one that I added earlier. And again, I'm just going to insert a new row, and coming down to line 4, and I'm then going to choose my open cust item FlexiField group that we've just created, tab my way through, and as soon as I tab, it then says, right, where do you want this to be displayed? So again, I can just choose tab number 4, the next available number in that list. What do I want to call the tab? So I'm just going to leave it called open items. Again, I've got my section option, so this is just one section on the tab, and the section name is open items per customer. So again, I'm going to leave that as it is. I'm not making it mandatory or multilingual, and the status is N to make it active. So I've saved all of that. So that's now saved. And then my final step is to then go and give access. So I'm going back into my menu, and I'm going to navigate into the settings area, system admin, users and access, menu-based access. I'm going to expand home, financials, accounts receivable, customer master file, and then I'm going to go down to my tabs and open the folder. and I've now got a tab called Open Items. And again, you can see there's no access there at the moment. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to add in the system roles again. Just while I'm in here, if I just scroll across slightly, the options that you're giving to the users is either R, which is read only, and U for update. So what I'm saying is they can read the information and they can update it. Obviously, if it's results of a browser inquiry, they can't edit that data. But on the previous example, with those fields, they would have had read and update access. So again, I'm just going to save that information. I'm going to close the screen down, say yes to update the menu. I'm now going to go and test that that's then worked. So we're going to go back into EN, financials, accounts receivable, customer master file, customer, and I type in a customer ID, and you can see I've now got tab 7, open items. And if I go, there's my customer details that I created earlier. And if I go to open items, it's now displaying the information here. So I'm just quickly typing in my cust ID, and it has then brought that information through. So I'm only looking at the results for customer 1000, and I can then see all of their open items. Okay. So that's a couple of examples of creating FlexiFields. So I hope that's kind of helped everybody.